say it's all on yeah, sure. Actually, yeah, sure. I was like, ours is down.
Oh yeah, you can.
Okay. Pretty good. I have pretty severe dyslexia. Debate's hard. It's only harder when you can't keep up. I did parley debate for a while in Canada. They don't interrogate issues. They don't really do much of anything in parley debate. So I really appreciate the fact that my opponents exist in this space to interrogate the reality that is at hand. I do believe in change. I believe that we can make change in the debate community, but we have to be realistic about that change. Some of the most dominant narratives of debate is that there should be a limited topic and that speed is important. When we decided to read this affirmative this year, we decided to tackle the topic in a way that we thought might recenter debates, might make inroads to change throughout the season what where people are going. The topic committee next year are going to understand about how apps go forward and how we come to understand debate communities. We are 0-2 right now, but we're not going to be forever. So we really do feel that in some way our political imagination exists in a space where this meta-narrative can be constructed in a sense and in a fashion that actually affects change in the debate community to recenter ideas. Just like there is a possibility through ableist discourse, through criticizing ableist discourse to change the way the debate community functions. But let's get down to this. Physical disability debaters can't participate. This is kind of one of the claims that are coming out of the block, but I don't necessarily know what the warrant for that is when physically debaters do participate in the debate space. Is it more difficult for them because of the normative constructs that exist? Yes. Should we challenge them? Yes. But do we challenge them in the sense that dreaming in the form of the alternative is standalone enough to make things work? I don't think so. They claim that the links that are inherent in the way that we've come to kind of understand how this debate has played out over the last couple of speeches are basically links of omission, right? We did think about ableism before we came here. They asked me in the cross-sex of the 1AC, just crossing out the word paralyzing mean that you've taken out the link. If the link is that we didn't consider the perspective of disabled people, yeah, it does take out the link, but also there's no impact to this because we're not activists the way they'd like us to be activists, but we are activists, right? To us, the people who identify as Latinos, the foremost conversation about legal status is how we kind of wanted to come to this topic. I'm also disabled, but I want my activity, my activism to be the most right for the meta-analysis that I'm most comfortable affecting, right? And I don't think that my perspective is the best for that argument. As someone who's shy about even admitting that he has this the cognitive disability that I have because of how much ability and privilege that I also have, I don't feel comfortable reading a 1AC about ableism and how we can rupture it in the debate space if our advocacy is that the 1AC Speech Act is what does that rupture. There's obviously always a place for ableist discourse because we live in a hyper-ableist society and in an ableist community, but it's not necessarily enough to say you didn't talk about this specific issue that we think that you should talk about in this specific way. That's not necessarily a link to the way that their criticism functions, right? They talk about all of their other evidence in terms of the link is that people of color and all these problems about how like people of color are displaced, but it's like the majority of their ableism critique is disparate from this form of link analysis, right? They make a lot of links about how people of color can't operate here and people of color can't operate there, but a lot of that both plays into our criticism under 1AC of how the debate space functions as a legal, both juridical and fundamentally and cognitive space, right? How that understanding of what is and what isn't, the is and the out, the in, the other and the that, and the self is posited by legal analysis, but it also says that the links that they're basically providing you are kind of, they're extraordinarily shallow. Moving on to the permutation debate, the permutation is a methodological understanding, a meta-narrative of negotiating what people disagree about. There's no evidence on the perm from the negative side of this debate. It's functionally conceded. There's no warrant as to why we can't solve for ableism. The alternative is a little bit problematic in their sense, right? Because we can talk about it in the context of the permutation, but we can negotiate it in the context of the permutation, but in the context of the alternative alone, disability studies are posited as the solution. But disability studies don't always work for disabled people. My mother has a blood deficiency that keeps her out of the marketplace for sometimes days at a time, relegating her to an undesirable capitalist position. But when I tell her about activism, when I tell her about ableism studies and the classes I've taken within the academy, she tells me, Joe, I'm tired. Ableism studies also privilege certain types of ableism based on which lit base is the biggest, right? Because the way that they've constructed this alternative in terms of dreaming isn't just about dreaming. The card that they read is titled Thinking with Disability Studies. It's not enough to dream of an alternative. You have to then interpret those dreams in a way that is functionally amenable to the political status quo. That has a lot to do with being subsumed by broader political narratives instead of doing what the alternative on our side of the debate does in terms of what doing the permutation does, which is create a meta-narrative whereby we come to the table with the people who have dominant policy understandings and challenge those norms in a way that actually affects some type of change in the end, as opposed to simply dreaming, but not only dreaming, then thinking. They kind of talk about how people with cognitive disabilities aren't able to come to the forefront of those discussions, but if those people are having to be relied upon to then interpret their dreams in a way that the academy can understand, because as we all know, all the cards that they read are from academics who exist inside a highly structured, highly ableist, highly legal institution where legal language and juridical purposes are the most forefront of how they make arguments and how they make their case, then I don't necessarily understand how we're really creating the most accessible form of debate by voting for the critique. We could just vote for the alternative and both understand that ableism is a problem and understand that at the end of the day, policy narratives are going to be dominant and that they need to be challenged in a way that makes effective change. They talk about how we're they talk about how we haven't talked enough about the deportation from the community. People who can't make it here don't even have the opportunity to be deported. But our role of the ballot subsumes theirs in this sense, right? We talk about how the deportation, the topic committee process has a lot to do with why you should vote for an alternative that says no, we have to stand up, we have to make voices to oppose this. Their argument, their role of the ballot, which is to think with, or to posit disability studies, to work with disability studies, doesn't do anything to remove the individual. Doesn't do anything to insert the individual into those conversations in a way that makes amenable positive policy narratives in the spaces that we're granted, right? In the crossings of the 2NC, they said that the all can't solve for people who've been deported, who can't. But what about the people who've been deported, who can't dream anymore because their dream was to come to the United States for a better life, and then that dream was taken away from them? They've kind of given up the desirability to dream. So we have to destabilize dominant narratives. And even if you took for granted that there are two dominant narratives in this round, one about ableism and one about deportation and legality, it's a question of how in this room and outside of it we solve for that issue in that instance. And we think that a meta-analytic approach is probably the better way to do so as opposed to the dreaming. So, at the end of my 1AR, you basically have these two sets of alternatives on the floor, and it's a question of which alternative actually reaches the conclusions and the impacts that both teams seem to think are pretty important. I'll just end with this. The Holocaust thing kind of underscores how they're trying to make the biggest argument and not the truest argument. If their arguments were true, they wouldn't necessarily have to tether them to a highly problematic construct like the Holocaust. They could just necessarily posit them and understand and implicate their impacts in the debates.
412.